Hi, I am Courtney Cheetah with Wild Farm Alliance, and thanks for joining us today for the fourth Role of Birds on Midwest Farms webinar. This is the fourth lesson of 10, and this year we're celebrating our 25th anniversary here at Wild Farm Alliance. Since the year 2000, we've been working with farmers to achieve healthy, viable agriculture that protects and restores wild nature. And we have a 2050 vision in our three program areas. We aim to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms in our Farmland Flyways program, hedgerows of habitat the length of to the moon and back, which is around 500,000 miles in our Farmland Wildways program, and then 10% of river frontage on farms planted to farmland waterways, leading to 100,000 miles of ravine habitat. There's an array of publications and videos in our resource section of our website, including a publication on nesting structures for beneficial songbirds on Midwest farms and a beneficial bird native plant chart for the upper Midwest. We're super excited to announce that we have a new video resource. This is the first of 3 Midwest-centric videos about avian pest control on Midwest farms. And this video highlights Keewaydin Farm in Viola, Wisconsin, and the barn swallows that they partner with in pest control on their farm. It's a really great video. Definitely go check it out on our homepage. Today's webinar is integrating habitat into croplands, prairie strips, and bird conservation. And our speakers are Jordan Geisey from Texas A&M Kingville and Matt Stevenson from Iowa State University. Next month will be our 5th lesson, and we will be talking about birds on farm, balancing biodiversity and food safety. That'll be on January 13th, 2026 at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time, and we hope that you will join us. We are offering 1 credit of CCA credit from the American Society of Agronomy. To receive that credit, please have your license number handy and enter it into the evaluation form, which we'll be sharing at the end of today's webinar. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And if you're having any issues, let us know. Today we're going to start with Jordan, so I'll have you share your slides and get started.
Great. All right, yeah. So thanks for joining everybody. So Matt Stevenson and I are going to be talking about some of the things we're working on for our PhD dissertations at Iowa State University regarding wildlife response to prairie strips. So just a little bit about me. I'm originally from Fremont, Nebraska. Got my bachelor's degree at the University of Nebraska. And no, I don't want to talk about what transpired in the Nebraska-Iowa game on Friday. Got my master's at Tarleton State University in North Texas and PhD at Iowa State. And now I'm down in South Texas at the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M Kingsville. And I work on water birds, so everything from game species like northern pintail and other ducks to wading birds like egrets and herons. But today we're going to talk about the STRIPS project. So the STRIPS project, if you're not aware, stands for Science-Based Trials of Row Crops Integrated with Prairie Strips. And this started way back in 2007. We're going to talk about some of the phase 2 results. I'll give a brief introduction on phase 1 of the STRIPS project here in a few slides. But kind of the onus for the Strips project was, I'm kind of preaching to the choir probably with this webinar, but we've had this massive conversion of the historical grasslands in the central United States. About 80% of all grasslands in North America have been lost to conversion to agriculture, and only about 1% of the original tallgrass prairie remains in most states. And a lot of this is due to intensification of agricultural practices, and that also results in, not only more acres being tilled and produced from, but also the removal of like those natural and semi-natural features like field margins and hedgerows and small woodlots and things like that. And so, of course, this region has lost a lot of this prairie or, historical cover, and it's resulted in these states being very productive. I think Iowa, last time I looked, was number 1 in corn and pig or pork and egg production. I think number 1 in ethanol production. I think number 2 in soybean production. So there's a reason for this. So we have to maintain kind of this production mindset, but also be able to carve out a niche for conservation. And so things like targeted conservation of less productive tracts within fields can provide ecological improvements. And so this land sharing strategy where you're not taking, entire blocks or tracts of land out of production, but trying to have conservation that works alongside agricultural production is kind of the driving force of the Strips project. And so this is kind of a common scene on the landscape in Iowa now, and we're going to talk about wildlife and birds specifically today. If you put yourself in the shoes of a migratory songbird, a grassland songbird that's returning from the southern U.S. or South America, and you're returning to this landscape in May, this is kind of one of those things that you come across. And so trying to establish a territory, attract a mate, and build a nest and produce some young in this kind of landscape where you're actually relying on tall grass prairie is kind of a difficult uphill battle. And also, this is another common scene. And so, maybe one of the most unfortunate things is you get large rainfall events, and even in areas like Iowa, where you have a lot of tile drainage that's been established over decades and decades, large rain events will result in this mass runoff of water and things that are associated with it at the field level. And so all of this is kind of the driving force. And there's been, practices like terraces and filter strips that have been used for a long time, especially in areas with more slope like western Iowa. But, a terrace usually is established with some type of cool season grass, in this case, smooth brome grass that establishes quickly, is not going to be too fussy about what you're doing with it. And so even for things like grassland birds, these kind of low diversity features like terraces don't do much because they don't provide much in the way of structure for nesting habitat. And grassland birds, I'm sure some of you know, are the most imperiled community of birds. We've seen about a 53% decrease in the community at large since 1970. And so even things like eastern meadowlarks, which we see quite a bit in places like Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin, about three of every four of those meadowlarks has been lost since 1970. So some of these species have experienced really precipitous declines. And it gets back to this point of how do we balance conservation and agriculture? We have to keep feeding the world. We have to keep producing in these states that are, agriculturally based. But how do we find a way to also maintain clean water and provide wildlife habitat and maintain soils? So, as I mentioned, STRIPS Phase 1, which started way back in 2007, was a group of researchers from Iowa State University, including Lisa Schulte Moore and Matt Helmers and others. And they established experimental trials of prairie strips at Neal Smith National Wildlife Refuge. And so they sewed the prairie strips into contours of fields. And over the course of several years monitoring the situation, they found that there was about a 37% reduction in soil or in water runoff. I guess it's 42%. Sorry, I misquoted there. And 95% less soil export and around 85 to 90% less phosphorus and nitrogen export at the field level. And so these numbers really, spoke to people. This was kind of the first stab at, integrating these contour strips in farm fields. And so this was kind of the first phase of that. And so I wanted to show a brief video, a cool drone video that we have that shows kind of what these prairie strips look like laid out in the field. And so this would be a prairie strip in late July or August where you have a nice wildflower bloom going on. And really, a big hurdle that the Prairie Strips Project climbed in 2018 was getting it explicitly listed as a conservation practice in the Farm Bill, in the 2018 Farm Bill, listed as CP 43. And so we've seen a large increase in the number of acres. And I think this is kind of a dated one. This is about a year and a half ago I last updated this, but I believe there are now about 26,000 acres across 14 or 15 states now. And so that hurdle of getting it officially listed in the Farm Bill as CP 43 was something that really encouraged more enrollment. So that's kind of a brief summary, and Matt will get into maybe a little bit more of the specifics with what's happening, within a prairie strip for wildlife. But this kind of overarching question that Matt and I tried to tackle with our PhDs is, do prairie strips benefit wildlife? And we're going to do that through the lens of birds. So all of those numbers that I mentioned, the 85 to 90% reduction in phosphorus and nitrogen and reductions in soil and water export really spoke to people. And beginning, in the mid 2010s, early 2010s, we started to see growth of prairie strips across working farms. So it started at Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge and eventually transitioned to actually working commercial farms across Iowa, which allowed us to expand some of the questions we were going to ask, including wildlife response. So we see a lot of these, and this is kind of, I think I showed one in a soybean field. This is kind of what one in August would look like in a cornfield, maybe July. And so, one of the biggest concerns when thinking about wildlife impacts with prairie strips is this idea that we're creating ecological sinks. And I won't go, Matt will probably go a little bit more into this, but the idea is that you're creating features that look great for wildlife. So maybe grassland birds specifically. And so they're flocking to those areas, they're piling into those areas, but they're actually experiencing higher mortality rates than they are birth rates. And so you're creating a situation where it's almost a trap for those animals to go into and try to start a nest when really they don't have much chance to fledge offspring. And so one of the aspects of that, and Matt will definitely get into this, is cowbird parasitism. So we think about ecological sinks and predators like raccoons or coyotes coming through and predating nests, but actually it can be something like brown-headed cowbirds, which are parasites and lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and that can result in reduced productivity. So the thing I'll be tackling here over the next, 10 minutes or so is comparing the grassland bird abundance in fields with prairie strips versus conventional crops. So it's kind of the first question we have to get at, are there actually more birds in fields with prairie strips versus conventional crops? And you can see kind of a better, more in-depth look at this project. We published a paper last year in the Journal of Agriculture, Ecosystems, and Environment. For our study area, we used 10 commercial farms across Iowa, so everything from down in southwest Iowa and Pottawatomie County over towards Cedar Rapids and north of Cedar Rapids. We used a pair comparison study design where we had a treatment field, a prairie strips field, next to or adjacent to a control field within each farm. And that allowed us to keep crop type and management consistent across fields and with similar topographies and soil types. And what we did is we conducted bird point counts, which is a very common method for sampling, for surveying bird populations. You travel to a point, you wait for a minute, allow birds to go back. This is during the breeding season, go back to their normal behavior, and then conduct a 5-minute survey where you're identifying every bird that's vocalizing or you see around you and estimating distance to those individuals. And the distance aspect allows you to eventually get at an abundance or a density estimate, looking at how far away birds are from you, and kind of with some fancy math allowing you to estimate your ability to detect those birds, which we call detection probability. So I guess I'll back up for a second here. So I just wanted to kind of give you a glimpse in what these sound like. And so this first audio, I'm gonna have 2 slides with audio embedded in them. This first slide is kind of representative of what a person that's conducting a bird point count would hear when they go to a field that's 100% crops. And then the second slide will be what a person who's conducting a survey might hear in a prairie strips field. So that's the conventional crop field, 100% crops field. So you can kind of hear a dick sissel kind of off in the distance. And it's kind of a good contrast with the next slide, which is a recording taken from a field with prairie strips. And so I've listened to that a few times. You can kind of pick up maybe 10 to 12 species in that. And so the complexity of these communities is really easy to see just from audio recording. So we had a project where we had audio recorders in fields too, and this is kind of some of those things we took from that. But from the actual bird surveys, the in-person bird surveys, we made about 14,710 detections of 81 bird species, 17 of which we considered grassland birds, meaning that they require grasslands or prefer grasslands for nesting. The 5 most common grassland species, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with these, were red-winged blackbird, dick sissel, common yellowthroat, eastern meadowlark and western meadowlark, and those were about 97% of all grassland bird detections. And in that comparison between fields with prairie strips and 100% crops, we found that there were about 87 more birds overall, so just all birds, not just grassland birds. 190%, so almost three times as many more grassland birds in fields with prairie strips, and a little bit higher species richness. So really, we saw, compared to the density difference, we're seeing a little bit, just barely a little bit more species richness, which speaks to the idea that, we see a big response amongst a few species, and not necessarily everything. And so this is a comparison between prairie strips versus crops only. So you have the control in the orange color there, and then the treatment, which is crops with prairie strips, in the bluish color there. So you can see the comparison among all birds, all grassland species, and then kind of at the species level. But kind of the take-home point here is that we really see, especially those three species, red-winged blackbird, dick sisel, and common yellowthroat. That's kind of where we're seeing the largest responses, those few more abundant grassland species, and we don't really expect to see it with maybe some of the area sensitive species. And another aspect of this is kind of looking at prairie establishment. And so anybody that's kind of done a prairie reconstruction or restoration project knows that it can be a slow process. You don't drill seeds into the ground and see a flourishing tall grass prairie in year one and year two. And we kind of saw that kind of lag also with the bird community. So really a big jump after year one. And generally with prairie strips, they're mowed one to four times in year one, and so there's a lot of babysitting even with prairie strips, even such a narrow feature like that. And then another jump, a significant jump in year three to year four, which is kind of a similar trend you might see with if just looking at plant communities within prairie strips. And also, one of the big things is the size or the amount of grassland acreage within these fields. And so, prairie strips range what they look like physically, has quite a bit of variation. There's 5 meter wide prairie strips and there's 20 meter wide prairie strips, depending on the properties we were at. And so the amount of acres of prairie within those fields or within those survey locations also was pretty important for increasing the density of birds. So, kind of in summary, we had about three times more grassland birds, specifically in fields with prairie strips, and about among those species that responded the strongest, there was about 2.5 times more red-winged blackbirds, 3.5 times more dick sisels, and 3 times more common yellowthroats. And so I want to thank all the folks that were involved in this project, and Matt will have a similar slide in his presentation. But we had a lot of collaborators, a lot of funding agencies that went into this 5 to 6 year project that we worked on. And if you want more information about this, prairiestrips.org is the place to go to. You can see things like landowner testimonials and more specific questions about how to get started. There's a lot of cool field days you can get involved with if you're interested in hearing from farmers that are enrolled in the project. And with that, I will take questions if we have any.
I think you've covered most of the questions in the strips, but or in the chat. But there's a question about what happens when strips are full of invertebrates and then the field gets sprayed with insecticides.
That's a good question, and Matt might be able to answer this a little bit more better than I can because he's more plugged into the project over the last few years. But yeah, so I think that's maybe one of the frontiers of future research is you still have a lot of the pesticides and herbicides that are happening around prairie strips, and so there might be some type of buffer effect of being able of having kind of the natural vegetation and the natural cover for things like insects and prey strips, but they're still exposed to the same things that some of an insect on a terrace in the middle of a 100% crop field would have. And so I can't speak to specifically what's happening with the insect research. There is a lot of ongoing, including pollinators and butterflies specifically. So Matt might be able to talk a little bit more to that, but that's probably some ongoing work that's happening now.
And then Kelsey has a question about curious on the funding from Bayer. Is that mostly to the university or this project specifically? Do you know?
Yeah, I also can't speak to that. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you, but yeah, it might have something to do with Iowa State specific research. But yeah, I'll have to get back to that person as well.
Sounds great. Let's launch the poll questions. There they are. If you could answer those, we would much appreciate it. And then I'll have Jordan go over those in a minute.
Yeah, and I saw there was a question specifically about terraces. Can
Right.
they be seeded with other grasses and prairie strips that could be used as habitat for these birds? I think the strategy with prairie strips is often similar to terraces. So prairie strips are planted on the contours of fields, and so they're kind of planted in the same areas that terraces would. They're just kind of a higher diversity, have better structure. So yeah, I think one of the advantages of going from nothing to prairie strips is that you don't have the seed bank that a terrace would. So if you went directly from a terrace, which is essentially a pasture, to a prairie strip, you're going to have a lot of weed issues and things that are in the seed bank coming up. And so the management you might have to babysit a little bit more, but I think that could be feasible. But I think there is an advantage of going from Roundup Ready soybeans to prairie strips. You have a lot less of a fight with some of those weeds that are going to be popping up in year 1 and 2. So.
Great. Let's close the poll there, sharing the results. Jordan, you want to go through these for us?
Yeah, so the first question, which bird species responded the strongest to the establishment of prairie strips? And it looks like 60% of you got it right. It was red-winged blackbird. I was going through it and I noticed that I had 3.5 times more dick sissels. So just the comparison, the proportion was higher with dick sissels and red-winged blackbirds, but the sheer abundance of birds, red-winged blackbirds responded the strongest. And then everybody got number two. Well done. Which group of birds has experienced the steepest decline in North America since 1970? Grassland birds. So everybody did pretty well on those.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Next up is Matt.
Yeah, so I'm Matt Stevenson. I did my PhD work at Iowa State University in Lisa Schulte Moore's lab with Jordan, and we sort of divided and conquered on some of these wildlife habitat questions. So Jordan did questions related to are the birds there or what birds are there, and I did questions on how well are they doing. So that's kind of the part that I'm going to cover. So most of my intro slides, Jordan covered. I guess I'll just emphasize this point that in the Midwest in particular, majority of the land is privately owned. So any kind of large scale wildlife conservation in these areas is going to require partnerships with private landowners. Federal Farm Bill type conservation programs are really important to that. And so they represent an opportunity where if we can really optimize those programs for wildlife habitat, it can have a major effect in these areas. So this is an infographic about prairie strips as conservation practice 43 in CRP. We get feedback from farmers that they really like the flexibility of the program. During strips 2, most of the prairie strips we were looking at were infield strips, like planted on the contour. But under CP43, they can also be edge of field, and they can go on the contour, or they can go straight up and down the hill. They can be pivot corners. There's a lot of flexibility in how this is implemented. So check out your local NRCS requirements if you're interested. So I also just have some visuals of what some prairie strips in Iowa look like. They might be in hilly areas. They might be in pretty flat areas. They might be on a contour. They, in the wintertime, are often sort of the only thing taller than a foot out there. And this is one of our research farms. I think Jordan had some photos of that one as well. They do benefit from burning like any other prairie. So my major area of research was, are prairie strips quality wildlife habitat? So we need to start with some definitions. What is quality? So we're saying habitat quality is all of the resources and ecological constraints that govern fitness, and fitness is survival and reproduction. And we're saying that it is of sufficient quality if the habitat serves as a population source rather than a sink. So the animals that are breeding there are producing more young than the total number of animals that are dying in that habitat patch. This is a really big, broad question. For today, I'm going to focus on sort of two different ways that we can define habitat. We're going to look at the configuration of the habitat. So in this case, the width of the prairie. And we're going to look at the vegetation, since that's one of the major differences between sort of business as usual and prairie strips. So looking at both the diversity and density of the vegetation survival. So my research looked at nest density and survival, and I used a pretty similar subset of sites that Jordan did. So these results are going to be from 9 commercial farms. Most of them, maybe about half of them were privately owned and half of them were institutionally owned, either by ISU or other entities. And then 2 reference prairies that sort of represented a full field prairie restoration that wouldn't have some of the size concerns that prairie strips might. When we looked for nests, we used double observer plot searches in different sort of archetypal conservation practices. So in prairie strips, but also in contour strips or filter strips that had low diversity plantings. So mostly like a smooth brome grass monoculture, or maybe like a forage mix, something like that. And then also comparisons to, again, that full field prairie restoration. We looked for nests in structured plots to determine density, and then also just we would take nests anywhere we could find them for the survival analysis, and nests were revisited until they succeeded or failed. And then we measured a bunch of things about the vegetation near the nests and some landscape scale stuff on GIS. The analysis for the nest density was a generalized linear mixed model. For survival, it was using program mark. And the goal was to compare those sort of archetypal conservation practices. And then we wanted to know what was driving differences. So we looked at vegetation diversity, density, width, and then a handful of other variables that we thought were probably important to the system, but weren't sort of specific research interest. So we developed this global model with everything of interest in it, and then a list of all of the possible subsets of those models. We fit them all, made predictions for every subset, and then averaged them by the weight of the evidence for that model. Before I get into the results from those, some bonus research. So because of the way we did our vegetation surveys, we were able to look at preferences of grassland nesting birds to different plant species. So comparing what plant species were within a half a meter of a nest to those that were like 5 meters away, so that the plant species were there, but they were not selected for. So the ones at the top of the list in red here are ones that were used less often than they should have been based on their prevalence on the landscape. So things like smooth brome was strongly avoided. As far as a nesting resource for above ground nesting birds, like blackbirds and dick thistles, the brome grass just doesn't have any structure for them. It won't hold the nest upright. And then some other species, Canada wild rye, rattlesnake master, Canada goldenrod, for whatever reason, these species were not used as often. And then at the bottom of the list are plant species that were selected for more often than would be suggested by their abundance in our plots. So reed canary grass and Canada thistle, not the most desirable species, but they do provide that structure that a lot of above ground nesting songbirds need. But then some like gray-headed coneflower, wild bergamot, little bluestem, golden alexander, some things that prairie managers might be a little more excited to find in their restoration. All right, for nest density for grassland songbirds, we're going to go through our 3 variables of interest one at a time here. So this is plant species richness, which is a way to measure diversity. And this is all grassland nesting passerines together as a group. And then we have red-winged blackbirds separately. They formed about half of our sample size. Blackbirds are loud and they get up in the air and screech at you when you're near their nest, which is super convenient when you're searching for nests. So we found a lot of blackbird nests. And then about 25% of our sample was dickcissels. And then the other 25%, which goes into the group up here, was like 21 other species of grassland nesting passerines. So plant species richness effect on nest density. We saw significant effects at the grassland nesting passerine level, at that sort of functional group level, and then for dickcissels as well. Not a significant effect for red-winged blackbirds, but the same sort of trend. So in planting in a monoculture, so if we had a nest that only had one species around it, which would typically be brome, compared to a diverse prairie planting of 60 or more species, we found more than 7 times as many nests per acre or hectare in the diverse plantings than in the monocultures. And then the same sort of effect size for dickcissels alone. Very few nests in the low diversity plantings, lots of nests in the high diversity plantings. For vegetation density, so we think that this matters because there's in a tall planting of grasslands, there's just more volume of space that could be inhabited by nests, right? So sort of a brome grass monoculture is more like a surface, and a tall grass prairie is more like a volume. So we needed to include this as well, and we found a significant effect for grassland nesting passerines as a group. So a really short grass situation, we found fewer nests in taller, denser stands. So either like a mature tallgrass prairie or a whole bunch of reed canary grass, sort of either one of those situations, about 2.5 times as many nests. And then sort of weak, non-significant effects when you break out blackbirds or dickcissels on their own. And for conservation practice width, so this is basically the width of the grassland with the edges defined by row crop in most cases, but maybe like a stream or a homestead or a road. Those would all count as edges as well. We did see some crowding into the narrower practices compared to our widest practices, which were our 2 reference prairies. So for grassland nesting passerines as a group, there were about 3.5 times fewer nests per hectare in the really wide prairies where there's a lot of habitat available compared to the narrow. And the same sort of thing for red-winged blackbirds, but not significant, and also a significant difference for dickcissels. For red-winged blackbirds, for their nest density, the most important thing by far was how close the search plot was to permanent water. And that one variable sort of swamped out everything else. The blackbirds were selecting based on proximity to water, and that ate up all the variation in that model. So taking that sort of mechanistic, like individual variable level and then making predictions to the conservation practice level, so conservation practices might vary in width, diversity, and density of vegetation all at the same time. So how do the individual variables stack up? So again, the green is the grassland nesting passerines as a functional group. On the right, we've got a couple of different prairie practices, and on the left, a few low diversity grass practices. In general, the prairie practices had higher nest density than the low diversity practices. So like so comparing like the contour strip to the contour strip, those were not significantly different. Yeah, so sorry, I misspoke there. The diversity not making a huge difference here, um, but you do see some of that packing going on. So the two narrow practices, the contour strip and the filter strip, compared to maybe a similar diversity large patch, the narrower practices had more nests in it. The same sort of plot for blackbirds. Again, like I said, the major thing that the blackbirds were concerned about were proximity to water. So these filter strips popped up with higher densities compared to everything else. And for the dick thistles, some differences, but this is our smallest sample size. So, you know, the prairie contour strips had higher densities than like a large patch of brome grass. But some of the like shape metrics inside a prairie weren't significant at this level. Um, and then maybe a few differences between terraces and contour strips to large patches. So again, that sort of the width of the practice is what's driving the density. Okay, so we see that the narrower conservation practices are increasing the density of the grassland birds. This is grassland bird nests. This is a little bit concerning because this is the first step towards having an ecological trap where you're pulling birds in to reproduce there compared to other available habitat. So now we need to see what the outcome of that is. Are the birds surviving there at an acceptable rate? So for the nest survival results, again, we're going to start with a vegetation diversity. And good news here, the diversity really is important to the survival for the nests. So looking at the solid lines only for now, this is an interaction term with mowing. So in areas that had no mowing, um, a nest was 5.5 times more likely to fledge young in a diverse planting compared to a monoculture for grassland nesting passerines overall. Sort of a similar effect size for red-winged blackbirds. Red-winged blackbird nests were more likely to fledge young in diverse areas than in monocultures. And the same sort of trend, but not significant in dick thistles. Okay, so the dotted line is really important here. This is how much mowing activity was nearby by the time, so this is about like 21 days after incubation. And areas that had a lot of mowing, it was worse. The outcomes were worse in high diversity plantings. So this is a function of the height of the vegetation and where the birds can put their nest. So in a monoculture situation, this is typically smooth brome grass, but could also be like reed canary grass. Those nests survived better on average when they were mowed over compared to prairie plantings because the nests in the prairie plantings could be further off of the ground and they were more likely to get knocked down by the mower. So an important caveat that the prairie areas had higher survival when they weren't mowed or after the mowing was finished. For vegetation density, nests survived better in denser vegetation. This could be a function of it being harder for predators or cowbirds to find the nests. But for grassland nesting passerines overall, nests were 9 times more likely to survive to fledge in this is 150 centimeters, in the 4 to 5 foot vegetation range compared to really short vegetation. And another really strong effect for red-winged blackbirds. So having that volume of vegetation was really important. And for width, we didn't see any significant effects. So, maybe a little bit of a trend, but the width of the practice was not predictive of nest survival. So how does this shake out at the practice level? So for grassland nesting passerines as a group, prairie on the right, low diversity grassland plantings on the left, we see this strong effect of diversity where all of the prairie practices survived at about equal rates, and they were mostly higher than the nest survival rates in the low diversity plantings. Similar sort of trend for red-winged blackbirds, the prairie plantings, so prairie contour strips, filter strips, and the large reference prairies, all those nests all survived at about the same rates, and the lower diversity plantings had lower survival. And then again, the Dixisals with the smaller sample size was hard to tease out. So what does this mean for the question of sources and sinks? So you can see that the prairie contour strips were not any poorer habitat than the large prairie restorations. So when we say large here, we're talking something on the order of 1 to 200 acres. And we'll come back to whether or not that is really large here in a minute. And survival in the prairie practices, in the linear prairie practices, tended to be higher than that in sort of the status quo. So the low diversity terraces, contour strips, filter strips. So we saw that first step where more birds were coming in to nest in the narrower practices. But in the prairie practices, we didn't see a difference in nest success between what in our expert opinion was high quality habitat and in the prairie strips. So why are we using expert opinion here? In order to get sort of a definitive answer on what is a population sink, you need to know more than just the nest survival. The nest survival is a really important number, but you also need fledgling survival, for which you have to put radio telemeters on the fledglings and follow them around for weeks. You have to band the adults, and putting telemetry on them is better because you need to know the survival of the adults after migration. And basically, it is a much larger, more expensive study that we were not able to do. So instead, we need to compare to the handful of studies that did all of that work and say, okay, our nest success was higher or lower than those studies. And so we think it's probably a sink or not a sink. So given that, the survival in our reference prairies tended to be a little lower than some of the other population numbers. So in some other places like Kansas and one study that did some modeling work in northern Iowa, the overall nest success rates that we found might have been sinks if those numbers were applied to like the fledgling survival rates, the renesting rate, the adult survival rates seen in these other studies. But these are what we reasonably believe to be the best available habitat most grassland nesting birds have a chance of finding in Iowa. So if you look at a land cover map of Iowa and you say, for every pixel of grassland on that map, what are the chances that its patch size is a certain size? So here, the smallest bin number, which is this skinny line way on the left, is 3.2 hectares, or about 8 acres. This is equivalent to taking a square section and giving it a 16.5-foot ditch all the way around that square section, and there's no other grass, right? That is by far the largest or the most common patch size for grassland in Iowa. There are a few larger patches out there, but for your given bird, they're going to be encountering these small patches. So while So for prairie strips, we saw that plant diversity was an important positive predictor of both nest density and survival. Higher diversity plantings was better. Higher density plantings was better for nest density and survival. The nests that we saw in prairie strips had survival rates that were similar to those in our larger reference prairies, so large by Iowa standards. And the low diversity grass strip practices had such low nest survival that they probably were ecological traps for a couple of those species groups and conservation practice types. A couple of them had low enough nest survival that that they are probably sinks. For the prairie strips, although we can't make a definitive statement about whether or not they are a population sink, they are at minimum safer than what most of the habitat is on the landscape, and so probably represent an improvement on the status quo. Some other caveats there. We didn't see sort of area sensitive species like bobolinks or Henslow sparrows. Many other species of grassland nesting birds are still going to need big patches of habitat, but prairie strips don't seem to be dangerous, and they probably help. So thank you to the many undergraduates that collected all of this data and our funders. And like Jordan said, so this is the funding slide for the entire Strips 2 endeavor. So many of these went to sort of other specific research questions. I'm not sure how Bayer was involved, but Jordan and I's research was mostly funded by the Farm Service Agency and the Leopold Center here at Iowa State.
Thank you so much, Matt. Wow, that was a lot of info. Let's launch the poll question quick, and then we can get to the Q&A. Quick question, I guess, while the poll question's up there. How many years was the study?
I had nest data from 5 years.
That's great. Awesome.
Yeah, so we collected from 2015 through 2019, and our full data set was like 1,600 nests. So about 800 of those were red-winged blackbirds, maybe 375 or something were dixisals, and the rest were like 21 other species.
Is there like a definitive answer of like how big is big enough to get good? Do we know that?
So we got, for the questions that we asked, we got good numbers for red-winged blackbirds and for sort of all grassland nesting birds lumped together. The issue is more that to sort of get a definitive answer on the source sink question, you have to collect different types of data, and they're much more expensive. They require equipment. You have to catch and handle the birds individually. And then you have to hope that you get some, inter-year recollection of data, and that's just a much bigger effort.
Awesome. Okay, let's have you go over the poll questions.
Okay, so my first question was, what aspect or aspects of a conservation practice affects its habitat quality for at least one of the species of breeding birds that we talked about? Select all that apply. And it seems like the multiple choice must have worked. So I edited my talk after I submitted this question, and we didn't talk about nearby trees or shrubs at all. So that may have been an indication that was the odd one out. But width, diversity, and density was important to either nest density or nest survival for at least one of the species. So it was an A, B, and C answer. The second question was, which of these conservation practices had the highest nest success rates? So the choices were low diversity grass terraces, low diversity grass contour strips, low diversity prairie strips, high diversity prairie strips. That low diversity prairie strips is a weird one. I'm not sure if I submitted that wrong or what's going on. But anyway, people sniffed out the right answer there. High diversity prairie strips of these choices had the highest nest success, and it was similar to sort of a full field restoration prairie.
Great. Thank you so much. So we got a couple questions in the chat that we can ask, and then if there are more, please add them. Dan wants to know, did you look at any of these sublethal metrics of fitness, like morphometric and clutch size? And did you look at pesticide risk in relation to density and survival?
Yeah, so we really tried to minimize the handling of the birds. So we handled the eggs to candle them to get ages, but otherwise we didn't collect any morphometric data. And this is just sort of was a time trade-off. In addition to this research, we were also looking at reptiles and amphibians, and we had a trail camera study, and we're just sort of trying to hit the highlights instead of diving in deep on a single question. So we didn't do morphometrics. Pesticide risk. So this came up in Jordan's talk as well. There's a number of publications on prairie strips as pollinator habitat. So a couple looking at honeybees, some looking at native bees, publication on monarchs. And actually, Amy Toth and Matt O'Neill at Iowa State here have a forthcoming sort of synthesis paper on prairie strips as pollinator habitat, which sort of address some of these insecticide questions. The big takeaway there is these habitats are totally surrounded by areas in which insecticides are applied, and they can be found in the prairie strips, so they can be found in the soil and in the plant tissue and in the nectar and in the body of the pollinators themselves, but all at substantially sublethal doses. So I'm not an entomologist, I'm not a toxicologist, but so far, the evidence suggests that they are not a trap for insects as well, although that question is asked a lot. So I think it certainly warrants more study.
Great. Just to reiterate, Carl asks, like, so the bottom line, any restoration of prairie in Iowa, corn, bean desert, no matter how small, is a good thing, question mark.
As far as grassland nesting birds, relatively generalist grassland nesting birds goes, that is what we have found. So I'll hit that caveat again that we didn't find nests of grassland nesting passerines that are considered area sensitive. So Henslow sparrows, bobolinks, grasshopper sparrows. There were singing males sort of on the landscape, maybe in the reference prairies, but we did not find those nests in the narrow features. So, you know, these results are skewed towards red-winged blackbirds, which are a generalist species, but their numbers are declining along with the rest of the clade, and dickcissels, which are a species of greatest conservation need in Iowa. So they could benefit from this practice. Some of the other species of greatest conservation need are going to need larger tracts of grassland.
Great. Are there any next steps or future work planned on this topic for either of you?
There's always more questions. So my current role at Iowa State is as a research data manager at the Bioeconomy Institute. I'm writing grants, but no luck so far.
Jordan, any work that you're working on?
Yeah, not actual data collection. I've dived, so a portion of my dissertation was on pheasant use of prairie strips during the winter ringneck pheasants. And I'm starting to dive back into that analysis. It was too much to keep in the dissertation. So it's one of those things that I've tried to go back and revisit here in the last couple of years since we finished up. So hoping to have a publication out for that maybe sometime next year, but I'm kind of working on different things. But yeah, the idea that these things could be used as important winter cover for pheasants, I think is something that will be good to get out because I think they are actually pretty important. We think about, we worked on a lot of these things for breeding season wildlife, during the summer for breeding birds, but I think they have a lot of benefits just as cover during harsh winters, especially in parts of Iowa. So that's one thing to that I'll kind of be working on a little bit here going forward with prairie strips specifically is our pheasant movement analysis where we put GPS transmitters on birds and track them around during the winter.
That sounds great.
Yeah, and I guess for those interested, I didn't present results on reptiles and amphibians. I do have a paper on that. The bottom line of that one is prairie strips are not good snake habitat. I think probably because there's limited hibernacula in the prairie strips. They've been plowed, they've been picked clean of rocks. There's not many mammal burrows or whatever. So snakes are going to need a different solution. And I've still got like 2 million trail camera images that I'm working on. Like 95% of them are blowing grass. Hope to say something about sort of mammal use of prairie strips as well, but that's forthcoming.
Wow, that's a lot.
A lot.
Great. Yeah. Um, so are there species or don't some species need much bigger blocks of prairie? So are there species that do require bigger blocks?
Yeah. So off the top of the head, the few that I mentioned there in central Iowa, Henslow sparrows, bobolinks, grasshopper sparrows, even the meadowlarks. We only had a few meadowlark nests in the narrower practices, and probably in other taxa as well. Prairie strips aren't gonna serve as habitat for everything. We're mostly concerned that we're not. The first question was, let's make sure that we're not hurting anything. And the news seems to be good there. And there are some species which can utilize this habitat.
Great. And do you think that the birds are adjusting to the lack of large sites, or is agriculture changing bird behavior?
I am not qualified to answer that. I guess an anecdote in Iowa over the last, I don't know, 2 decades, upland sandpipers have started nesting in soybean fields because they're also area sensitive and they need big tracts of grassland, of which there really aren't many in Iowa. And so some pioneering sandpipers have decided that soybeans are close enough. Yeah, that's just anecdotal. I don't have any numbers for that.
Great. Are there any final questions? Throw them in the chat. I want to thank both Matt and Jordan for sharing all this great info. We have an evaluation that is up. The link will be in the chat here momentarily. This webinar is part of a professional development grant from the North Central region of SARE. So thank you, SARE, for making this possible. We'd love to have your feedback. If you need CE credits, we also need your license number. We'll be entering anybody who responds to the survey into a drawing to win a Wild Farm Alliance hat. So make sure you fill that out. And if there are additional resources and research papers related to this webinar, which you can find on the resource page for this webinar, which is also where the recording will be posted. And if I'm going to just double check there aren't any other final questions. Lots of thanks and great presentation messages in the chat. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Oh, I got one final question. We've worked with a researcher that measured pest control benefits from prairies. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Jordan, you want to take
it? Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Presumably there would be. So we're putting a bunch of insectivorous birds in where there weren't any previously. So probably they're eating insects. The question is whether they're eating the crop pests or the insects that are attracted to the prairie. And that's an area that I'm interested in. I think it would be really interesting to look at like what is being fed to the nestlings. But
yeah,
no numbers on that.
Yeah, and when I was there, I thought about, pitching an idea like, corn rootworms, soybean aphid, maybe they're, being predated by insectivorous grassland birds that we're putting more on the landscape. And so you could probably develop some type of bird exclosure experiment where distance from prairie strip, you were, height or protecting crop pests from birds with bird exclosures and see if there's some type of effect. I think that would be really cool, but that's definitely like kind of a next level thing that maybe somebody else will get to.
Yeah. Andreas Vargas has a master's thesis on predatory ground beetles,
Mm.
whether or not the predaceous beetles in the prairie strip come out to feed in the crop field. And I don't remember the results of that. The manuscript is forthcoming, and his thesis is available.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you in the new year.